Hello, this is Randall Lecoq, and this is the second podcast on the American Revolution. The first podcast, we covered the lead up to the American Revolution, with the difficulties between the American colonies and the British king, starting right after the French and Indian War with British taxation of the colonies that led to the First and Second Continental Congresses, where the colonies eventually, after trying to issue an olive branch to King George, finally voted for independence. The colonies, 13 colonies, voted for independence. Declaration of Independence was signed by 56 members of the Congress, and basically we've already been starting to fight with the British in April. This Declaration of Independence, of course, was July 2nd, was voted on July 2nd, but in April, just a couple months before that, we had already been fighting with the British at Lexington and Concord, and in a little bit in Massachusetts. So in June at Bunker Hill. So today we're going to talk about the war itself. We talked now about the Continental Congress and the build up to the war. We talked about Declaration of Independence, and now we're going to shift to the war itself. And this is going to cover quite a few years. It goes from 1775 basically to 1783. Basically it was over by 1781 at Yorktown, but it dragged on for a couple more years. So it's a long war, and the Americans were outnumbered, just trying to survive for most of the war. George Washington did a marvelous job, as we know, and here we are. So let's start the second presentation on the war itself, and then after the war we'll talk about the Constitutional Convention and the presidencies of Washington, Adams, Jefferson a little bit. So here we go on the war. Like I say, 1775, the war was focused initially in Boston or in Massachusetts, and a little bit in Canada. And following the April 19th engagements at Lexington and Concord, we had, like I say, the June Battle of Bunker Hill, Breed's Hill, above Charleston, Massachusetts. The British launched an attack with 11,000 troops under General Thomas Gage. On the Patriot side, Washington had three divisions with Generals Lee, Putnam, and Ward, with another general named Nathaniel Greene from Rhode Island, who would turn out to be very important. He was on the field. British general on the battlefield under Sir Henry Clinton, he attacked the rebel strongholds up there, the redoubts, eventually taking the field, but losing 40%. The British lost 40%, 1,000 men in the process, casualties. So they were too tired to pursue the Americans. In anger, the British burned Charleston, went back to Boston, and held it. But Washington occupied the heights around Boston and sealing it off. So you have kind of a siege, a winter siege, a stalemate in Boston. The British decide to just hunker down for a while, get more troops in. In the meantime, the Patriots, under General Benedict Arnold, who was our guy for a while, captured Fort Ticonderoga. And that was basically important for controlling the route between the colonies, between New York and Canada, of course, Quebec, controlling the Canadian route to New England, because Canada had a lot of troops up in Canada. British had a lot of troops up in Canada they could bring down. General Henry Knox, the Patriot artillery commander, he's a former Boston bookseller close to George Washington. He comes back to Boston with 58 cannons he'd captured at Ticonderoga. That's pretty important. The British minister for the American issue, Lord Sackville, tells King George III he needs to finish off the Americans quick before foreign powers intervene. The British leadership is still under the misconception, by the way, that the loyalists in the colonies, the Tories, constitute a majority of the population. They'll find out differently. To defend against possible attacks by the British generals Sir Guy Carleton and John Burgoyne coming down from Canada, a Patriot army under General Richard Montgomery sets out for Quebec with 2,700 troops. Ethan Allen leads another force of Green Mountain Boys from Vermont, storming Montreal en route to Quebec, but he's captured. General Benedict Arnold leads a third force which includes Americans Dan Morgan and Aaron Burr, starting from Maine and defeating a British armada on Lake Champlain in the process. But they encountered severe hardships, the American troops, colonial, on the 270-mile trek through the marshes. In the Battle of Quebec, the American General Montgomery was killed, and Benedict Arnold, the second commander, shot in the leg. 1/3 of Montgomery's army, many down with fever, desert. Most are captured. Big failure, that campaign, Canada. So we're shifted to March of 1776 now. Under food shortages, the British replaced Thomas Gage as commander with Sir William Howe. And they abandoned Boston at this point to re-outfit in Halifax and to shift from Boston to New York on April 13th, 1776. In May, a smaller British force under General Clinton with Lieutenant General Cornwallis sails to Cape Fear, North Carolina, and to Charleston, South Carolina, with Irish regiments from Cork, but they encounter storms at sea and are met and driven back at Moores Creek, North Carolina, and in Charleston by colonial troops under Generals Charles Lee and South Carolina Governor John Rutledge. The declaration is being signed at this time in Philadelphia. So you see the British are sending armada down to Carolinas. They're fighting in Canada, fighting in Massachusetts. Now we're shifting to New York. In July, Howe's army returns from Halifax to New York with 20,000 troops and puts ashore on Long Island. As an additional 6,000 Hessians arrive from England. Mercenaries, of course, from Germany. So we have 20,000 plus 6,000. That's a pretty big British force for Washington to handle. With the return of General Clinton's Carolina force, the one that ran into storms down there and came back, Howe now has a total of 32,000 troops plus 350 warships. This is the greatest military power in the world, Britain, we're fighting. The Battle of New York begins in late August on Long Island, where the Patriot General Charles Lee suffers a severe defeat. General Putnam puts up a spirited defense in a 6-hour fight at Brooklyn Heights for the Colonials, but barely escapes with his troops in the fog to Manhattan across the East River with the heroic help of the Maryland's Old Line Regiment, which held the British off while he escaped. Washington is blamed for dividing his army between Long Island and Manhattan and ignoring the importance of Long Island and for leading to the slaughter of American troops. So we're dealing with 30,000 British troops versus 12,000 rebel troops in New York. After retreating to Manhattan, where he's again under attack, Washington withdraws to Harlem Heights, where he achieves a small victory before being defeated again at White Plains. Howe, the British commander, is slow-moving, fortunately, and he doesn't quickly follow up. And Washington retreats across the Hudson River, leaving behind garrisons of colonial troops at Fort Washington and Fort Lee. These troops are captured. 3,000 prisoners are taken. So you see New York's not going well. Washington's on the retreat. He's been defeated everywhere. I mean, White Plains, the Fort Lee, Fort Washington. He's on the way down to New Jersey to get down and out of there. So Washington, at this point, he writes a letter to the Continental Congress, to his own Congress, and he outlines a static defense strategy to outlast the enemy, giving battle only under most favorable conditions, and abandoning New York if necessary. He can't risk the whole army, but must keep it together at all costs, protracting the war. The fate of the revolution is clearly at stake right now. Things are looking bad. In November, the British commander begins a campaign to control New Jersey as well, forcing Washington to retreat south from New York in December. Washington's tattered Continental Army of 2,000 to 300 regulars are low on ammunition, low on food, and they remain trying to hold on. But the Patriot militias have mainly departed. Generals Howe and Cornwallis, the British, have 10,000 British and Hessians in close pursuit of those 2,000 to 3,000 at this moment. This is the low point in the war for the Patriot Army. Washington and his general, General Nathanael Greene, who I mentioned from Rhode Island, who turns out to be wonderful, are both discouraged. Patriot General Charles Lee has actually lost faith in his commander, George Washington, and he is captured on December 13th. Thomas Paine writes at this time, "These are the times that try men's souls." But Washington once again saves his army. The Delaware River offers protection if Washington can get over it. He successfully commandeers barges and leaves the British to button down for the winter with 4,000 troops in New Brunswick, New Jersey, 3,000 British troops in Princeton, New Jersey, and 3,000 Hessian mercenaries, German British mercenaries, in Trenton, New Jersey. Philadelphia is at this point only 30 miles away. This is colonial capital, and one half of its population and the Continental Congress have fled. They fled south toward York. General Howe makes the decision, the British general makes the decision at this point to shift his army southward towards Philadelphia rather than up to the Hudson Valley as originally planned. He is bedazzled by loyalist support in the middle colonies, including Pennsylvania, and wants to force Washington to defend the rebel capital, Philadelphia, in a set-piece battle. He had originally hoped for a decisive battle in New York, but Washington escaped. General Burgoyne, the British commander, basically is coming down with the British force from Canada down the Hudson toward Albany. They're going to link up with General Howe. The British commander is heading toward Philadelphia, and they'll split the colonies in half right down the Hudson River between the east and the west, so they'll join together in taking Philadelphia. But it doesn't work out that way, because General Burgoyne was supposed to meet with Howe up there at the Hudson before they move on to Philadelphia, but Howe decides to go after Philadelphia. In the meantime, General Burgoyne, coming down from Canada, kind of ignores General Howe's switch and continues to move his British army south from Canada towards Albany and the Hudson. He had originally hoped for Howe's support from the east, but he will proceed anyway without it. It's going to be a big mistake. Ben Franklin is in Paris at this time, but Louis XVI is cautious on supporting the colonies. He's just lost the 7-Year War, French and Indian War, to Britain, losing Canada in the process, and the Bourbon monarchy fears the American democratic example spreading a little bit too widely. Nonetheless, Benjamin Franklin, a masterful diplomat, beloved by the French people, and the Parisians in particular, he presses France to enter the war on our side and abandon neutrality, arguing that the colonies otherwise may at some point have to come to reconciliation with Britain, which would not be good for France. On the other hand, if France, Spain, Holland, and the colonies unite, England is reduced. Franklin relies on charm and is patient. Louis is tilting but fears supporting a lost cause. The colonies need a victory in the war. We shift now to Christmas of 1776, not that far away. We've been fighting all through 1776 down through New York and New Jersey. Britain, you remember, they buttoned down for the winter. They battened down in Trenton and Princeton for the winter. So following, knowing that enlistments are running out and despair is setting in, Washington plans a surprise attack on Christmas night, 1776, over the icy Delaware River, hitting the British and the Hessian troops, which are buttoned down in Princeton and Trenton, then escaping to Morristown, New Jersey, for the remainder of the winter. The raid is a success. He does hit them, surprise them, as we all know, going across the river, frozen Delaware. And the Hessian commander, by the way, General Rall, is killed, and his 900 mercenaries surrender. The victory here at Trenton and Princeton gives the colonial army, Continental Army, Washington's army, new spirit. He has 7,000 regular troops, as the Connecticut and Rhode Island militias decide to remain in camp. Colonial financier Robert Morris has come up with $50,000 of his own money to pay those volunteers to remain. Perhaps most important, Washington has learned that war is not linear, but a matter of ups and downs. British victories at Long Island and at White Plains were followed by defeats at Princeton and Trenton. There is still hope. Winter camp in Morristown ended what John Adams called the most critical and dangerous period of the Revolution. Early 1777, still in the winter, General Howe has 16,000 troops versus 7,000 for Washington. This is typical. But he asked for an additional 15,000 King's troops to complement the 70 residents on hand. He has suffered a ponderous New Jersey campaign, and his forces are dispersed from Montreal all the way to the Carolinas. British generals Carleton and Burgoyne are driving south from Canada, but are bogged down near Ticonderoga. General Howe controls Boston, Rhode Island, Savannah, and New York, but is discovering that he has both a patriot army and a country to combat. And King George III is adamant on victory. General Henry Knox, Washington's artillery commander, is hopeful after Princeton, quoting Shakespeare in a letter to his wife. There is a time in the affairs of men when taken at the flood leads to victory. There had been 4,500 military actions, since Lexington and 9,000 colonial casualties. Yet the American Army of War was emerging as an army and managing a strategic draw. Washington has somehow held the army together and is incorporating the militias. Abigail Adams, John Adams' wife, who was always very perceptive and brilliant in her analysis back in Braintree, Massachusetts, writes to her husband John, who's in Paris, quote, misfortunes, talking about General Washington, misfortunes have called out the hidden excellencies of our commander-in-chief. That's what Abigail said. But look back at overall, 1776 has been a difficult year for Washington and the Continental Army. So now 1778, 1777, 78, after the winter, after the New Jersey, Washington's successes in striking at Trenton and Princeton, we're settling down now to two fronts. One up north towards Saratoga, New York, near Albany, where the British are coming down under Carleton and Burgoyne and being met up there by Benedict Arnold. And the second one is the campaign toward Philadelphia. The British are still, you remember the General Howe is determined to take Philadelphia, the continental capital. And he's kind of ignored his buddy coming down from Canada who needs his help maybe up there. In January 1777, Washington, following victories at Princeton and Trenton, attacks Howe's advance guards heading toward Philadelphia, driving 3 British regiments back to New Brunswick, New Jersey. He then retreats. Washington then retreats to his winter quarters at Morristown to rebuild his army. Things are relatively calm until July 1777, when Howe's 18,000 British and Hessians board 266 ships and sail south, arriving at the mouth of the Chesapeake in August before disembarking and approaching Philadelphia from the south. So they're going around Washington's blocking action to get Philadelphia. They're going down south and come up to Philadelphia from the south. Washington shifts his army toward York, Pennsylvania, struggling to keep between the British and Philadelphia, but fighting a losing battle at Brandywine on September 11. This is followed by engagements in Philadelphia's Great Valley, near Philadelphia, where Anthony Wayne's Pennsylvanians, Mad Anthony Wayne, Pennsylvania line is ambushed at Paoli and almost wiped out. That's one of Washington's most effective commanders, is almost wiped out south of Philadelphia. Washington is finally forced to abandon Philadelphia, which the British occupy on September 26. Congress retreats to York, Pennsylvania. So the British have Philadelphia. They've done it. They've taken it. But Washington's not deterred. You see, this is interesting. He resumes his standard policy of isolating British garrisons, controlling the countryside, and sniping at British foragers out there trying to get food. In October, he attacks a British outpost at Germantown, just north of Philadelphia, But the plan fails due to a lack of coordination. The British control the Delaware River forts, and now with Philadelphia, they feel they could power on through the Middle Atlantic region, which is, Pennsylvania, New York, Maryland. Washington's army at this year, last time they wintered in Morristown, New Jersey. This winter now, they're going to winter at Valley Forge, outside of Philadelphia, where 2,500 of his soldiers die that winter of illness, malnutrition, and exposure. So it's a really rough time. We talked about the times of try men's souls. This is it, Valley Forge. There are mutinies in February in Washington's army, but he talks the troops into returning to their post. He himself works very hard. He shows great willpower, and he inspires the others with his determination and his refusal to give up. He brings over Baron von Steuben, a Prussian who was discovered by Benjamin Franklin. And Steuben trains the troops into a more professional army at Valley Forge. He also has a new quartermaster. Remember I talked about General Nathaniel Greene of Rhode Island, who was up in Massachusetts. A very wonderful general. And Nathaniel Greene is working to overcome clothing, shelter, and food shortages. What he's doing is going around to Pennsylvania farmers who've been selling their products to the British and saying, no more of that. We're taking all of your products, all your produce, all of your pork, whatever, and we'll buy it from you. But no more selling to the British. And so he's solving the problem getting food. The Quakers, of course, tried to remain neutral, stay out of the war. They'll sell to anybody, but they are loyal. Washington has a good plan, maintaining the army, seeking foreign assistance, and using defensive strategy. He has excellent subordinates in Greene and von Steuben, and Knox. Robert Morris, the financier, is offering IOUs for 3 months' pay, full value if the soldiers re-enlist for the duration of the war. It's pretty tough to re-enlist when you've been starving and dying of exposure. Word comes to Valley Forge of while they're there, in that difficult time, they get the word of a major colonial victory at Saratoga, New York, on February 6, 1778. France joins the colonies in alliance after that victory. Britain declares a war on France as a result in March of 1778. So now we have France with us. Washington has France. We've been hoping for that. Franklin's been working for that. So Britain's plan of using Philadelphia as a base for control of the Middle Atlantic colonies also fails, as Howe discovers loyalist weakness in the area. They thought this was going to be a Tory stronghold. And he learns that capture of the rebel capital of Philadelphia is irrelevant. In June of 1778, General Clinton relieves General Howe, British general, and he marches his army of 10,000 back to New York. He's being sniped at all the way by Washington and Charles Lee. At Monmouth, New Jersey, Washington holds out in the face of a strong British counterattack. As they're retreating, they counterattack. They're tired of being sniped at the rear, proclaiming a tie as a victory. What was a tie? We call it victory. General Anthony Wayne, always aggressive, plays critical roles in this Pennsylvania campaign at Brandywine, Germantown, and Monmouth. So that's pretty important. That Philadelphia, they take Philadelphia, but it seems like business goes on as usual and didn't change the war at all. They own the capital, but everybody just didn't pay attention to it. So the next thing I'm going to talk about a little bit is the Saratoga campaign. You remember that's what brought France into the war, the Battle of Saratoga at Frazier's Farm, where we defeated the British coming down from Canada. That was their first big defeat. It was a major defeat, and it brought France into the war on our side. In January of 1777, while Washington is in Valley Forge winter camp, British commander Sir Guy Carleton in Montreal keeps 3,500 soldiers to defend Canada and sends General Burgoyne with 7,000 troops toward Albany to sever the Hudson River corridor. He thinks he's to be joined by General Howe's army pushing west from New York. We talked about that en route to Albany. But Burgoyne attacks at Crown Point and Ticonderoga, but colonial troops under Ethan Allen, the Green Mountain Boys, escape south and destroy a Hessian unit at Burlington. General Horatio Gates, American colonial general, arrives in Albany in August and takes command of the Northern Department of Washington's army. He has 10,000 troops, almost like Washington, including New England Militia and Dan Morgan's Virginia Riflemen. These are really tough soldiers from Winchester, Virginia. Burgoyne learns of Howe's shift of interest to Pennsylvania, forcing him to go it alone. He knows he's on his own up there now. Howe's not coming up to rescue him. In October, Burgoyne's light infantry are intercepted at Freeman Farm near Albany, cutting off the British supply line. The British throw everything in, and they launch bayonet charges across the farm, Freeman's farm. Gates has Dan Morgan, the Virginia Rifles, and Benedict Arnold, retreat to the Bemis Heights, where they finally stop the Hessian attack from the British left and the British Highlander attack from the British right. So they're facing the Hessians, and they're very tough, and the British Scottish Highlanders. So they stop them, and the British are cut off and defeated by Benedict Arnold and surrender on October 17th with 5,000 prisoners taken. That's when the French came in. The rebel victory at Saratoga over Burgoyne's army in late 1777 assuages the colonial defeats near Philadelphia and causes French intervention while demoralizing American loyalists, the Tories. By failing to take the Hudson and split the colonies, Britain also loses New England for good. General Gates takes all the credit for the victory, and his feud with Benedict Arnold begins, his deputy commander. Arnold thought he won that battle. Gates took all the credit. This ultimately leads to Benedict Arnold's treason. From 1775 to 1778, Washington's army has struggled for survival, losing New York and Philadelphia. The British, driven out of Boston, had returned with overwhelming power and a sense of purpose. But at Monmouth near Philadelphia, the rebels finally hold their own with the British regulars on the field. In the meantime, Saratoga has fallen for the British, bringing France into the war. Things are shifting. Washington wisely realizes that it's going to be a long struggle nonetheless, and not necessarily in his favor. He will have to look for opportunities for victories, like at Saratoga, that will shorten the war. Loyalist support for Britain among the populace has not materialized. That's an interesting thing. The Britain thought that once they started winning the battles, all the population would come over to them. Although the British still have control in New York and Canada. But with French intervention, it's clear to say in 1778, the war has entered a new phase. Now the British shift we're in 1778, 1780. The British shift to a southern campaign. After taking Philadelphia, they didn't do any good. After losing in New York and losing New England, they shift to they think they have a lot more support in the Carolinas and Virginia. So they shift to a southern campaign. Washington and Clinton remained in the standoff in New York, but British troops are conducting successful raids in Virginia under, by this time, turncoat General Benedict Arnold turned against us after fighting for us. Washington's army, which has suffered a very difficult winter at Morristown, is tired and war-weary and can only offer limited resistance. French assistance to the colonies has not been forthcoming in a significant way. That's a real disappointment. In 1779, the war's been going on since 1775. Britain decides on a new southern strategy to leverage the loyalist support for Britain in the Carolinas and Georgia and drive north through Virginia, cutting the colonies in half and disheartening the patriotic movement. That's the plan. And at the same time, after they take the Carolinas from Virginia, split the colonies, they'll march for a final push into the mid-Atlantic states. The expansion of the war in 1778 to include France and Spain also joined on our side, poses a new threat for London, arguing for this southern campaign where the Royal Navy can protect their army in the Carolinas by being close offshore, while guarding its colonies at the same time in the West Indies. In January 1780, British General Cornwallis and 7,600 troops from Clinton's army arrive in the Carolinas. Although there is initial success in taking New Bern, Savannah, and Charleston, in Charleston, a colonial army under General Benjamin Lincoln surrenders, the British soon encountered partisan bands of rebels in the interior in the Carolinas, South Carolina, under commanders like Francis Marion, Thomas Sumter, and Andrew Pickens. This is a big factor. And they can't be suppressed, surprisingly. Two wars are going on in the South. One between the British and the Continental armies, and a second, a civil war in the countryside between the civilians. There are organized Tory or Loyalist regiments of Carolinians loyal to Britain, but Loyalist-leaning citizens, fearful of reprisals from their rebel neighbors, are afraid to join or feed the British. Bad behavior by the British troops in the South also adds to the Patriot side. British are quickly discovering that the Southern Loyalist sentiment is a myth. General Gates, who won at Saratoga, is sent by General Washington to replace Benjamin Lincoln, who surrendered at Charleston. But Gates is soundly defeated by Cornwallis at Camden, South Carolina, losing his entire army. We lost one entire army for the colonials. This is a particularly harsh blow for the Patriots, coming on top of the loss of Charleston. So, Carolinas is a toss-up. Washington replaces General Gates with General Nathaniel Greene. Remember, I told you, the one I admire, who is Washington's best general. Cornwallis quickly moves in hot pursuit of Greene. Cornwallis is a very good British commander. He moves in hot pursuit of Greene, leaving his artillery and supplies behind so he can make the chase. But Greene is quicker, and he adopts a cat-and-mouse strategy, hit-and-run tactics over swampy terrain, taking advantage of natural river barriers to slow Cornwallis while coordinating with local guerrilla commanders. Remember, I mentioned Sumter and Pickens and so forth. For the sake of maneuver, Greene divides his army, sending part to Dan Morgan, who's from Virginia, colonial rebel, to the Western Carolinas where the British have outposts. Like Washington, Greene is defensive, losing battles but inflicting heavy losses on the enemy and escaping with his army intact. That's what Washington's been doing through the war, and drawing Cornwallis away from his supply bases, exhausting him and keeping him facing north. So the first Patriot victory in the South comes at a place called Kings Mountain, South Carolina, near the North Carolina border, where rebel backwoodsmen called Over Mountain Men defeat a major Tory militia under Colonel Patrick Ferguson. So the British militia got beat down there. Shortly thereafter, British regulars under Banastre Tarleton are routed at Henna's Cowpens in South Carolina by Dan Morgan's regulars. That's called the Battle of Cowpens. In the meantime, Nathaniel Greene, with the majority of his army and Henry Lee's cavalry, is being pursued north through Charlotte and the Virginia border, but he stops long enough to engage Cornwallis at the Guilford Courthouse in North Carolina in a set-piece battle. Here, Greene uses Morgan's successful tactics from the Cowpens battle to slow the initial British attack, placing 3 lines of North Carolina militia in front and asking them only 2 well-placed musket shots before retreating back, before you fall back. Just get 2 shots up. Give us time. Just give us time for 2 shots to slow the British down. Then you can fall back, because the militias are not the regular army, of course. The British then run against 3 lines of Virginia and Maryland regular army Continentals who are waiting for them when the other guys retreat to them. And they counterattack in the woods to neutralize the British bayonet. The British are famous for using the bayonet. It's hard to use the bayonet in the woods. At Guilford, North Carolina, Greene loses the field, Nathaniel Greene, our guy, but suffers only minor losses while inflicting over 500 casualties on the British, who were forced to fire cannon into their own troops who were being overrun. Cornwallis does not pursue Greene anymore, and he limps away to the British garrison at Wilmington, North Carolina. So Greene has been losing battles occasionally, but winning the campaign with his hit and run. Pressure on the British outposts increases as backcountry support dwindles for the British, and Tory loyalists, those citizens in the South, fear Nathaniel Greene's presence. It is now clear that the British have never committed enough troops in the Carolinas to give the loyal supporters of them encouragement. By early 1781, the British are confined to Charleston and Savannah, with the outcome of the South to be decided in Virginia. Nevertheless, in 1781, January, there is a stalemate in the colonies, and the war will seemingly go on forever. Both sides are exhausted. Britain holds a few seaports: New York, Newport, Norfolk, Charleston, Savannah. Rebel and French forces have bottled them up and control the countryside, but the rebels are weak and broke. Now we come to the final phase, 1781 Yorktown. In December 1780, British General Clinton sends 1,600 British troops under Alexander Leslie and Benedict Arnold to Virginia, where they join another 2,000 troops under General Philippe. General Cornwallis, the British commander, arrives from North Carolina in the summer of 1781 and assumes command. He now has a total of 7,000 British troops in Virginia. He is opposed by an equal number of rebel forces under Anthony Wayne and Lafayette. General Clinton is concerned and warns London from New York. We can expect no loyalist help in Virginia. The southern colonies are gone from us. With winter coming, the British need a warm anchorage where the fleet can support them. They settle on Yorktown, Virginia. Give up the initiative and dig in. They're not getting support from the population. The population is afraid of the colonial supporters that will take action against them if they support the British. Meanwhile, in New York, Washington's army is dug in against Clinton in a continued stalemate. In June of 1781, Washington suddenly learns that Admiral de Grasse and the French fleet, with 4,000 French troops, have appeared in the West Indies and are available to help in Virginia. The French are finally doing something. Washington decides on a daring plan supported by de Grasse, the French admiral. Washington gathers 3,000 of his own troops in New York, plus French General Rochambeau's 4,000 troops in nearby Newport, Rhode Island, and marches together south in a secret, swift movement overland, leaving a screening force back in New York to deceive the British. So they're making a surprise attack south, leaving the British to think they're still up in New York. Their 500-mile forced march south. Washington and Rochambeau joined Lafayette in Virginia, trapping Cornwallis at Yorktown. In a naval engagement near Yorktown, de Grasse's French fleet keeps the British fleet at bay, unable to come to Cornwallis's assistance. Nor did the British General Clinton in New York learn of Washington's departure, his movement south in time to get troops south to help Cornwallis. Cornwallis is surrounded at Yorktown, and on October 17th surrenders to a coordinated U.S.-French attack. This is the end of the war for Britain. They still occupy New York for 2 more years and control Charleston, which is surrounded by Nathaniel Greene. But the fighting has virtually stopped, and Britain has decided to give up the colonies and make peace. Franklin, Adams, and Jay negotiate the Treaty of Paris in 1783. So the lessons are, Britain didn't have the strength to fight a prolonged land war in the colonies and a naval war at the same time against the Spanish, French, and Dutch. The Patriots had a superior level of commitment, and their defensive strategy of holding out and fighting only on their own terms was successful. Washington, he was an unflappable symbol of American resistance. In New England, Britain faced an enraged American population and had few friends. And they controlled the major cities of Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and Charleston, but that didn't have much effect on the war that the British generals had hoped for, as long as the colonials still controlled the countryside. This Tory sentiment did not increase, and gradually hostility toward Britain grew, in part due to British and Hessian troop behavior. They always say you have to win the local population, the hearts and minds. British didn't do that. French intervention turned out to be the critical factor. Before that, the British had the initiative, and the Continental Army was on the ropes, retreating. But Washington, his achievement was to hold off the British until foreign help arrived. The Battle of Princeton was important in ensuring continuation of the war after defeats in New York and New Jersey. But basically, it was a stalemate. Saratoga was important in overcoming doubts that we could engage the British regulars and in bringing French into the war. So in 1781, the tide did turn. One of the things that really helped was Ben Franklin in France was trying to convince the French to come in and support us or join the war on our side. And then later to try to get them to follow up by sending troops and supplies. They finally sent the French fleet under de Grasse and the General de Rochambeau to Rhode Island to help Washington at Yorktown. But in January of 1781, after a frustrating time trying to get the French to step up, Congress sent a young colonel, John Laurens. He was a friend and compatriot of George Washington. He was the son of South Carolina patriot Henry Laurens, and he was sent to negotiate loans from Paris. His father had been captured by the British on the high seas on one of his trips to go over to France, and was in London in the Tower. So in April, Washington wrote Colonel Laurens a letter, the son, telling him of the desperate state of the sons in Paris with Franklin. And Washington writes him and says, Colonel Laurens, you're a friend of mine, old friend. We're in desperate state here in Morristown, New Jersey. We have no food, no clothing, no medicine. We're at the end of our tether. If no relief comes, it will be too late. The impertinent Laurens, this young guy, whose father had been intercepted and was in the Tower of London, forced a meeting with reluctant King Louis XVI at Versailles. The French foreign minister was trying to keep him away from the king. Ben Franklin said, no, don't bother the king right now. But Laurens went up anyway. His dad's in the Tower. Laurens goes up and marches right up to the king and tells him exactly what Washington had told him in his letter of their state. If relief comes and doesn't come now, it's too late. So and what happened was that King Louis XVI said, oh, okay. He consulted with the staff, and he said, okay, I'm sending the French fleet under de Grasse to sail to America immediately. That could have been the war right there. So anyway, it's very interesting. And next presentation, I'll talk a little bit about the Civil War inside the war, because there was a war going on between the Tories and the Patriots in the colonies. It's quite interesting. We'll take it state by state and show which ones were loyal to George Washington and which ones are loyal to King George III. Thank you.